my question to Venerable is wanting to considering going into a monastic life a form of grasping? Did you hear my question?
I did. I heard your question. I think it's a very good question. One of the things that's really beautiful about the Buddhist teaching is we don't actually have to be perfect in order to do it. So anything that you're doing in practice, like say you're meditating, or say you're doing acts of generosity, or you're doing a lot of chanting. So there could be all kinds of different things that you do that's part of your practice. And those things that you do could have elements of grasping in them. It doesn't neutralize their value, however. So, but when you're considering something as big and as life-changing as becoming a monastic, it's a little bit like considering getting married, right? You definitely want to take your time and explore very carefully the terrain as you approach it. Don't just sort of jump in with both feet. There's an old saying, you know, marry in haste, regret at leisure. So, you know, I would just suggest, pragmatically speaking, if you suspect there's grasping in it, like a kind of greed to get something out of it, or an aversion to get away from something, the more clearly you can see that, the more clearly you'll be able to understand realistically the advantages and disadvantages of continuing to go down that path. If you don't know that there's grasping in your motivation, if you're unaware of it, then it will tend to be like a hidden force that creates an unpleasant surprise someplace down the line. So it's important to spend time trying to see clearly what the motivations are, what it is that you're hoping to get, and how much of it is like you can discern has some degree of personal grasping in it. So I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I think, that in my own case, I was aware that part of my motivation to become a monk, to get rid of my lay life, you could say, I didn't want it anymore. I wanted to be free of the burdens and responsibility of lay life. And so you could sort of see that's like an escape, a getting away from something, getting rid of something. And I spent, I don't know, 7 years going from being a lay person to being a monk, kind of back and forth a little bit before, you know, I finally was able to make the full plunge. And that's part of it's just my very cautious, aversive nature, feeling that maybe I'm making a mistake, wanting to be in control. But all these things were being illustrated, cross-examine myself, and keep reflecting on what it is that I think I'm going to get out of this, what I see the advantages and disadvantages are. When you do that and you're honest about it, you know, you won't really make a mistake. You'll be very clear-eyed about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And if it still seems like a good idea, then, you know, go for it. And you'll see only the experience itself can really show you whether it's a good idea or not. So you do your best judgment and try to go into it with as clear a vision as possible. But don't think that the fact that your motivation is grounded in your normal human motivations, the normal psyche of a human being, which includes greed, hatred, and delusion. That's part of what you have to work with. Makes it more complicated, maybe. But if you're already pure enough to be completely free of those things, you wouldn't need to become a monastic, right? So monasticism has a purpose, and part of it's to help you to free yourself, right? So I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you. I heard most of it. At times the signal was bad. I just want to add that I feel that it's like the natural course of my life. I've come to this age and I want to be completely immersed in learning and living the Dharma. It's
Mm-hmm.
like a natural part of life. Like you hit 20 and it's part of life to go to work, or it's, when you reach 60, it's part of life to be menopause. So it's part of life to, or it's the time ready to do it. If I miss it, I have to come back and do it again and live this life again.
That's right. That's right. That's a good way of looking at it. So, I mean, if you're seeing that, okay, there's a natural tendency for the life to move in this way, and you feel like you're kind of enthusiastic or quite willing, quite inclined to go along with that natural flow, then again, that's just something to be aware of, right? You don't necessarily have to believe it or use that as a justification for becoming a monastic. You have to look also at the pragmatic aspects that might be considerations, like how well can you wrap up a lay life and kind of put it all aside. Will you be creating undue burdens for other people? Can you do it in a very skillful way to leave one life and go to the other? But these are all just very practical, pragmatic considerations.
Absolutely, and that's the one I need to find out. I need to find people who will be able to advise me. That the last few lines you said, exactly what I'm looking for. People who to guide me. How do you wrap up this life without hurting someone? How do you, I'm also an aversion type of person. Can I adapt?
Yes.
How and who do I speak with is my question. So which I will write to the monastery rather than take up somebody else's time for questions.
Is that okay with you,
yes,
Venerable?
you can certainly do that. You can
Yes.
certainly write us a question. I'd be happy to answer it at more length if you like.
Thank
but
you.
just for the sake of everybody else who's listening,
Yes.
it's worthwhile to sort of see becoming a monastic as something like getting married, right? So you have to form a relationship with the monastery and with the people who are in the monastery in order to get a sense of who they are and for them to get a sense of who you are. And as you draw closer and you start to sort of like each other and see the possibility of spending more time together, at the same time, the fact that you're putting energy in that direction sort of naturally informs the people around you in your life that where your interests are. So you're kind of being very open about what your interests are. And then there's the whole aspect of, okay, what's the practical reality of your responsibilities? Is there a spouse? Is there children? Is there work responsibilities? And how practical is it for you to set these things aside? You can get a lot out of monastic life by affiliation. You don't necessarily have to become a monastic. So don't think that it's kind of an all or nothing kind of a transition that you have to make. You can, I've often thought that if I couldn't become a monk, I would have become a monastic steward, or at least moved closer to the monastery so I could visit more often, because I just find a lot of benefit in being in the environment and the peace that's here and having the guidance and the teachers. Like you said, immersing myself more fully, devoting myself more fully to this teaching. But if I had done that, then I'd still be able to do things like, pay for my nephew's education or something like that, because I'd still have access to money. So those things I have to let go of. But okay, I was able to make that transition, but not everybody, it's not a one size fits all kind of a thing. So it's very, very individualistic. And the main advice I would give is like, don't be in a hurry. Maybe be in a hurry to abandon that which is unwholesome, but don't be in a hurry to try to change your life in order to make something happen. Just kind of lean in that direction and put energy into that direction and pay attention to how things work. If things are going smoothly and it's sort of like it wants to happen, it happens by itself, then that means that your karma is well aligned with that directive that you have, that sense of direction that you have, will very naturally, like obstacles will sort of fall away by themselves almost. If there's a lot of resistance, then you have to pay attention to that and take that into account, because it might be that what your mind wants and what your karma will allow don't necessarily coincide. So you have to be very respectful of the realities of your situation and not try to force anything to happen. Okay, so maybe that's also something to bear in mind.
Thank you. I hear you. Thank you.
Sure.
So, the first question is, the Buddha gave us tens of thousands of suttas to help us understand the path of mind and body and the path of wisdom. Could you recommend several must-know suttas for beginners and several for seasoned practitioners?
Well, that's a really great question, and I'd be willing to give a recommendation, but I think that anything that I say sort of spontaneously will be necessarily incomplete. So I'll just throw a couple of them out there, and if someone would like to have me give a more considered response, I'd be willing to put more time into it and sort of write something out, right? Because I think it's actually quite useful. The great thing about the Dhamma is that about the suttas particularly, is there's a large amount of repetition in the suttas. So if I give you a list of like 5 really important suttas, somebody else could give you another set of 5 suttas that would have pretty much the same material in it. So there's no kind of like perfect list, just one's recommendation. So I just wanted to put that out there, that when you read the suttas deeply, you'll see there's a kind of almost holographic quality to the suttas, where the same themes, the same principles, the same ideas keep getting presented in different ways by different speakers in different occasions, sometimes using exactly the same words, sometimes using slightly different words. But there's a way that everything links together. And so you don't actually need to read all the suttas in order to understand what the Buddha is saying in the suttas. So I'll give you a few that I particularly like. I like the 3 cardinal suttas. I think that they've been chosen for a really good reason. The 3 cardinal suttas are the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which is the discourse on the setting in motion the wheel of the Dhamma. The next one is called the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, which is the discourse on the characteristic of not self. And then the fire sermon, the Dittapariyaya Sutta. Those 3 suttas in themselves contain the majority, the bulk of the teaching in a kind of a very succinct form. And if you spend time studying those suttas, you'll encounter elements of them that you won't understand on the first look. Like, the Buddha talks about things like the 5 aggregates of clinging. And he doesn't go into a lot of detail about exactly what those are, but you hear more about them in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, right? So those suttas kind of refer to topics that they share between them, and they expand on them more at length in different places. So if you familiarize yourself with those suttas and you get as much as you can out of them and their commentary, what people have had to say about them, that'll be a good start to be able to explore other suttas that are investigating or elaborating those same principles. So, in the wings to awakening, or the aids to awakening, they're fairly complete. Having said that, they're not very practical. They don't give you necessarily a whole lot of meditation instruction. And so you want to balance your study of the Dhamma with both like a textual, reading understanding, or hearing people talk about the Dhamma. This understanding of the concepts and understanding of the principles, very important. But also you need to get some practical instruction about how to practice. And for that purpose, the king of suttas, if you will, is the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, which is the great sutta on the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And this one probably needs no real introduction. It's the Buddha giving instruction on how exactly to meditate, including breathing meditation, body meditation, corpse meditation, meditation on feeling, meditation on the mind, meditation on, it's so important of a sutta that I'd say something like 20% of the modern commentary that you read about the Dhamma is in one way or another connected, maybe even more, maybe even 50% of the modern commentary on Dhamma is connected in one way or another to that sutta. It's very, very central to the teaching of practice, of how to practice. Now this is so far I'm just talking about Dhamma the way that we think about it in the West. It's also important to think to consider in terms of what the Buddha taught regarding what he called discipline. So there's what he called Dhamma and what he called discipline. Dhamma, he used the word Dhamma. Discipline, he used the word Vinaya. So sometimes it's called the teaching and the discipline. When he was on his deathbed and they asked him, who will be our leader when you're gone? He said, let your leader be this Dhamma and this discipline, right? So he hasn't just left us meditation instructions and some theoretical constructs. He's given us a whole body of teachings on how to train ourselves, how to train our hearts. And often that's what I'm talking about when I give a Dhamma talk, right? So discipline sounds a little bit like a burden or something that it's unpleasant to do, but it's actually the key to success in Dhamma practice. When you sit down to meditate, you're restraining the mind. You're limiting the amount of stuff that you're listening to or seeing or paying attention to, and you're putting your mind in a particular kind of a bounded area so that you can see more clearly what's going on inside there. So you have to restrain or put aside certain things and take up certain things, and this is called discipline or Vinaya. So in our chanting book, there's so the Tisarana chanting book, which you can find online, all the contents of it in one way or another are derived from the Pali Canon. So if you go through the precepts, the 5 precepts for lay people, the 8 precepts for renunciates, the 10 precepts for samaneras, and if you're interested in it, the 227 precepts for the monks, or the 331 precepts for the nuns, and study that to some extent, you'll get a sense, a more intuitive sense of what it is that the discipline is about, right? So it's not just following rules. It's a way of training the mind to be able to let go, right? To be able to let go of the things that cause the mind to suffer. So the rules are there to help illustrate the principle and to help keep, and also to support the community to exist. But if you just study, say, meditation technique and you never study the discipline, you're missing a large part of what the Buddha had to say. So I'll leave it there. So if you spent a significant amount of time studying those things, you'd be pretty far down the road in terms of knowing some good sutta material. And it would give you a great basis to be able to look anywhere in the canon and very quickly understand what you're looking at. So you're much less likely to get lost if you start with those few suttas as your starting points, as your anchors. Then you'll see that there's a lot of stuff that the Buddha says which is repetitive. Some of it is not particularly connected with the Dhamma. It's just filler, you could say, that's in the Pali Canon. But the real pithy, really important suttas are more easily understood if you're well grounded in those principles. One of my favorite suttas for more advanced contemplation is the I can't remember the name of it in Pali. It's called the Net of Views. It's the first sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, and it's the one sutta in the entire collection that it said the monks didn't like. Right? So usually when a sutta ends, the monks approve of the words of the Blessed One, and they rejoice in his words, and they say things like, some listeners will say things like, it's as though a lamp were brought into a darkened room, and so that people with eyes could see. And so there's kind of this praise for the Buddha's words. But this is one sutta where the monks didn't really like it. So whoever he was talking to did not approve of his words. But what he's teaching in that sutta, the net of views, goes to the heart of our tendency to conceive of a self in a world, and how that is at the root of our grasping. So if you feel like you want something a little more meaty, Dhamma practice purposes, that sutta could bear a lot of contemplation. So there's some ideas for you. And again, like I said, if anybody's interested and wants to write to the monastery, I can probably come up with some more things to consider.
I was in the walking meditation trying to look at my motivation, and I'm not sure it's looking for enlightenment, because I'm not sure I understand enlightenment, but it's looking for an end of suffering, and end of suffering for all as well as myself. And I sort of think that I've taken the vow of the Bodhisattva, and the question is that I double thinking myself, I'm doing that because I'm fascinated with phenomena. I want to stay here. So is it enough to want to end suffering outside as well as inside? Is that enough motivation to lead me on the way? Of course, lead me some way forward, but what am I lacking there?
If I understood it correctly, and please feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm getting it wrong. You asked whether the motivation to bring about the end of suffering for yourself and for all beings is sufficient for Dhamma practice, and I think you already know the answer to that. It definitely is. But also, I think there was some other nuance there, whether you're missing something, and maybe you could elaborate that just a little bit, because I'm not sure I quite understand what you're meaning by that. So could you, Norm, could you give me a little more
I think
insight into your actual question?
Right. I think it's because the enlightenment, maybe there's a version of oblivion, the blowing out of the candle. Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me just see if I've got this right. The Buddha was accused of being an annihilationist, someone who preached a doctrine that led to the end, to the annihilation of an existing being. And I think he was accused of that for very good reason, because some of the words that are used to talk about the goal of Buddhism, Nibbana, sound like the annihilation of something. Nibbana means cooling or going out. And there's also words like cessation and ending and so on. And so it can sound like it's quite possible to interpret this from the perspective of I guess you could say from the perspective of something not quite aligned with the right view, as the extinguishing of the life force of a being and the ending of the continuity of consciousness of a being, as though bringing about some kind of an annihilation. And that can feel like you're either involved in some sort of a death wish cult, or you're going to abandon the world of suffering and leave all these poor suffering beings to their own miserable fate, and you're just going to get out. And that doesn't necessarily comport with what we want. It doesn't sound that great, it doesn't sound like what we want to do. So, Norman, if that's approximately right, please confirm.
Very, 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 very close. Very, very interesting. Yes.
Okay, great. So This question comes up a lot. This is a valid and important concern. And rather than try to tell you, look, there's nothing to worry about, rather than say that, I would say it's really important to hold this question as kind of like a koan, like a bit of a mystery that needs to be investigated. Don't accept a simple, kind of easy sounding answer. This is not a superficial consideration at all. This is actually at the very heart of what the Buddha is teaching about existence, about personal identity, about suffering. So those components that you find, say, in the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, the Buddha goes over and over again and points out that form is not self, feeling is not self, perception is not self, mental formations are not self, consciousness is not self. And yet we all experience self all the time. Like, it's the thing that we experience the most, is like, here I am, there you are. You know, this is a self having an experience of encountering the world. So our ordinary experience, our intuition about what's going on here seems to suggest that what the Buddha is saying is somehow paradoxical or incomplete or wrong or doesn't contain the truth. And that's, whenever we see something like that, it's an indicator that there's more for us to do as practitioners, to look more deeply in order to understand what he's talking about. Because like it or not, the way that we use language and the way that we think when we're talking about things is linear. It's involved with the world of concepts and ideas and entities, and the notions of existence and non-existence are there. And it's very difficult for us to talk in a way that goes right to the heart of the matter directly. So both the Buddha and many of his interpreters later on would speak about it in a kind of a roundabout kind of way, and trying to point at the truth, but not being able to tell you what the truth is verbally. So the truth can't be told, it has to be seen. This is just part of what you have to do as a practitioner. So whenever you feel like there's something the Buddha's saying which kind of intuitively feels like there's something really meaty there, something really substantial, something really worth understanding, but you feel also that I don't get it. Like, how can there, you know, how can mental formations be not self? I mean, who's thinking the mental formations if it's not me, right? So surely they're me, or at least they're my possession, or they're under my control, or, you know, like somehow they're associated with me. They're my thoughts, after all. So if you have this kind of like an inner debate about a topic like that, it's that inner debate about it, or that inner uncertainty about the truth of something, is on par with it's at the same level as this uncertainty about what nibbana means, or is nibbana the extinguishing or the annihilation of me? And does that mean that then I'm no longer going to be around to help the suffering of other beings? I think that this actually even goes to the division or the split between the Theravada tradition and the traditions that it sprang from, and the later arising of the Mahayana tradition, with its great vow to save all beings. You know, so the idea that you're going to put off your own salvation, your own enlightenment, until all beings have been enlightened. So this notion of a great vow is almost like, it sounds like the inversion of what the Buddha is saying. Like the Buddha is saying, practice for your own salvation, and be diligent, do it now, now's your chance, don't waste time, quit screwing around and get down to business and free your heart. And it sounds like what the Mahayanas are saying is like, oh wait, you know, free your heart partially, but spend all your time saving other beings, because by golly, there's so much suffering in the world. Extinguishing your own suffering is just the tiniest little percentage, and so there's so much more to do. Please don't abandon us. So this is like a compelling paradox. Like, how can these things both be true? So who's right? So rather than try to answer it intellectually, verbally, cursively, way to answer these questions, the way to cut through all this uncertainty and confusion is through practice. And that's unfortunately the best answer I can give you. The practice will eventually disclose answers that you find satisfactory. But anything that anybody says to you, even your own thoughts, will always be somehow incomplete, always somehow not totally convincing, always subject to being maybe picked at or cross-examined or questioned. So that's why you can never find acceptability or final analysis or sufficient answer in anybody's verbal answer, especially even your own inner verbal answer. So don't accept those things. Just say, okay, I don't know. I have to keep practicing until I understand. And just accept that that's part of what we do in practice. We have faith that there's something really important here that's really worth our time to understand. And we keep practicing until we actually stumble across the truth, that the answer to all these questions is contained in that truth. So just have faith and keep practicing, and that will take you where you need to go.
Thank you.
So I hope that helps.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie, and thank you, Venerable, for very generously spending this time with us today. I have a very basic question, just practical about walking meditation, which I feel almost silly asking after this wonderful talk and these very in-depth questions. But the question is about sort of the proper placement of the arms and hands during walking meditation. I began practice about 20 years ago with a Zen group, and I don't know if you can see me or not, but we were taught to sort of clasp our hands across our chest like this. And the walking sessions were usually very short, only about 5 minutes between longer sitting sessions. But I continue often when I do walking meditation to clasp my hands like this, but I find I get a lot of tension in the neck and the shoulders and the upper back if I'm holding my hands like this for 45 minutes or an hour when I'm doing walking meditation. And it usually, I'm doing walking meditation on days when today when I'm sitting a lot more than usual, and I get the tension from sitting as well, so I don't want that when I'm walking, or it would be nice if the walking meditation helped to bring a bit of the relief of that sort of tension. So I'm just wondering if you could please suggest, maybe recommended ways of how to place the arms and hands when doing the walking meditation. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question, Colin. I appreciate it. I think different traditions have different ways of instructing on how to use the body for meditation purposes. But think about this principle. What you're trying to do with any meditation in Buddhism is you're trying to calm the mind, still the mind, and get practice at being able to direct attention to various subtle objects. And so the discipline that it takes to do that can take all kinds of different appearances. And so what you were doing with the sesshin, with the Japanese walking meditation by holding the hands in this way, would act as like a focal point, or at least a reference point for your overall sense of bodily awareness, which is you're trying to maintain when you're doing walking meditation. But as you've noticed, things like that can lead to tension if they're held for a long time. So what I would suggest is to be a bit more relaxed about it, or at least experiment with more relaxed postures. The recommended one that I was taught is to hold your hands in front of your body, crossed sort of very gently, or behind your back, like you're going for a walk and you're thinking about something important, right? So just cross your hands in front of your body or behind your body, rather than let your arms swing sort of at your sides. The swinging arms is less still. If you have a posture in the front where your hands are kind of gently clasped in front, or a posture where your hands are gently clasped behind your back, you can switch between those two and get a fair amount of relief. So maybe even think that, okay, when I'm walking from north to south, I'll be clasped in front. And then as part of my turning around process, I will very mindfully change my hand posture to be clasped in back. And then I'll go across the path again. And then I'll very mindfully turn around and clasp my hands in the front again. So then you've got something that you're doing with your hands where you're including the posture of the hands as part of the meditation. And you're also doing something sort of therapeutic to keep your body from getting too stiff and too uncomfortable. So those are some ideas to try out. there's no hard and fixed rules in Theravada teaching, or at least not from this tradition, other than the idea that you're using the body as a mode of focusing attention. So hopefully that will give you some relief for your physical issues. Right? Good luck.